Late Monday night, while most of Washington slept, Donald Trump opened Truth Social and dropped a diplomatic bomb that would reverberate across the Pacific Ocean before sunrise in Seoul. The tariff rate on South Korean goods jumping from 15% to 25%. The justification: South Korea's legislature hasn't ratified a trade deal fast enough. But before we dissect what happened, let's understand what makes this moment fundamentally different from every other tariff skirmish we've witnessed over the past few years. This isn't China, where trade tensions have simmered for decades over intellectual property theft and market access. This isn't the European Union, where disputes over steel and aluminum have historical precedent. This is South Korea, a treaty ally, a country that hosts 28,500 American troops on its soil, a democratic partner that has stood shoulder to shoulder with the United States through every major conflict since the Korean War ended in an armistice that technically still stands today. South Korea isn't just any ally. It's the linchpin of American strategy in Northeast Asia. When North Korea fires missiles over Japanese airspace, it's South Korean and American forces on high alert. When China projects power in the East China Sea, it's the U.S.-South Korea alliance that provides the counterweight. When semiconductors, those tiny chips that power everything from smartphones to fighter jets, need to be sourced from somewhere other than Taiwan, it's South Korean companies like Samsung and SK Hynix that America turns to. So when Trump threatened to slap additional tariffs on this particular ally, the shockwave wasn't just economic. It was strategic, it was psychological, and it sent a message to every American partner from Tokyo to Berlin. Your domestic democratic processes mean nothing if they inconvenience Washington's timeline. Let's walk through exactly what happened, because the details matter. In July of last year, after months of tense negotiations, the Trump administration and South Korea announced a framework trade agreement. The terms seemed clear enough. Seoul would commit to investing $350 billion in American industries over the coming years. We're talking semiconductors, shipbuilding, advanced manufacturing, the kind of industrial policy investments that create jobs in Michigan, Ohio, and Pennsylvania. In return, Trump agreed to lower his so-called reciprocal tariff on South Korean goods from 25% down to 15%. Then, in October, Trump traveled to Gyeongju, South Korea for the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Summit. On the sidelines, he met with South Korean President Lee Jae-myung. The two leaders shook hands. They smiled for cameras. And Trump extended that 15% tariff rate to South Korean automobile exports. A massive concession given that South Korea is one of the world's largest auto exporters. Everything seemed locked in. The deal was done. Both sides declared victory. Except there was one small detail. In South Korea, like in the United States, international agreements require legislative approval. The South Korean National Assembly, their parliament, needed to ratify this framework deal to give it the force of law. And that's where the timeline started to slip. President Lee's Democratic Party drafted the implementing legislation. They introduced it in November. And then it sat. Not because of bad faith, not because South Korea was trying to renege, but because South Korea's National Assembly, like any democratic legislature, has its own internal dynamics, its own political considerations, its own constitutional obligations to debate and deliberate before binding the country to international commitments. For Trump, this was unacceptable. The deal was struck in July. We're now in late January. In his mind, that's 6 months of delay, 6 months of South Korea not living up to its word, 6 months that demanded consequences. So on Monday night, he fired off the Truth Social post. South Korea's legislature is not living up to its deal with the United States. Why hasn't the Korean legislature approved it? I am hereby increasing the tariff from 15% to 25%. The targets: automobiles, lumber, pharmaceutical products, and any goods covered under his baseline reciprocal tariff regime. Essentially, a comprehensive escalation affecting nearly every major South Korean export sector. Now here's where things get particularly telling about how foreign policy is being conducted in 2026. As of Monday night, hours after Trump's announcement, the White House had not issued an executive order giving these tariffs legal effect. No formal policy document, no legal instrument that customs officials could actually enforce. Just a social media post. South Korea's presidential office, Cheong-hwa-dae, issued a carefully worded statement the next morning. They had received no official notification from the U.S. government about any tariff changes. No diplomatic cable, no call from the State Department, no communication through normal channels. Their first indication that their country was facing a 66% increase in tariff rates came from monitoring American social media. Think about that for a moment. One of America's closest allies learned about a major shift in trade policy affecting billions of dollars in commerce, the same way you or I might learn about a celebrity scandal, by scrolling through social media feeds. The Korean response was swift but measured. Kim Yong-byom, Director of National Policy, scheduled an emergency meeting for Tuesday morning. Trade Minister Kim Jung-kwon, who was in Canada for separate negotiations, immediately changed his travel plans to fly to Washington for emergency talks with Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick. The machinery of crisis management kicked into gear. But let's step back from the immediate crisis and examine what's actually at stake here, because the economic dimensions alone tell a sobering story. South Korea's economy is in a fragile state. The final quarter of 2025 saw economic contraction of 0.3%. For the full year, growth managed just 1%, the weakest performance since 2020, when the COVID pandemic brought global commerce to a grinding halt. For a country that depends on exports for 44% of its gross domestic product, these aren't just statistics. They represent genuine economic distress. To put that export dependence in perspective, the OECD average is 30%. South Korea is nearly 50% above that baseline. Their entire economic model is built on manufacturing goods and selling them to the world. When trade barriers go up, South Korean workers feel it immediately. And here's the cruel irony. Despite Trump's tariffs already suppressing demand for South Korean products, the United States remains South Korea's second-largest export destination after China. Last year, Seoul exported $122.9 billion in goods to America, 17% of their total exports. That figure was already down 3.8% year-over-year due to existing tariff pressures. Now imagine those numbers with tariffs jumping from 15 to 25%. South Korean automakers like Hyundai and Kia, already struggling with decreased American demand, would face even steeper competitive disadvantages against domestic U.S. manufacturers. Pharmaceutical companies would see their profit margins evaporate. Lumber exporters would lose market share to Canadian and domestic suppliers. But economic pain, as severe as it might be, isn't the full story. The strategic implications cut far deeper, and they echo across the entire Indo-Pacific region. Beijing is watching this drama unfold with great interest. For years, China has been working to peel South Korea away from its security alliance with the United States, offering economic inducements, threatening economic punishment, playing on historical grievances. The message from Beijing has been consistent. America is an unreliable partner, distant and distracted, while China is right here, economically integrated with your economy, ready to be your primary partner. Trump's tariff threat does Beijing's work for them. It validates the Chinese argument that American alliances are transactional, that Washington views partnerships through a purely mercenary lens, that no amount of loyalty or cooperation will protect you from being squeezed when it suits American domestic political interests. North Korea is also watching, and the lessons they're drawing are equally dangerous. The Kim regime has always sought to drive a wedge between Seoul and Washington. Every missile test, every provocation, every escalation is partly calculated to create friction in the alliance. When they see South Korea being publicly berated and economically threatened by its supposed protector, it reinforces their strategy of trying to deal with Seoul independently, without American involvement. Then there's Japan, Australia, the Philippines, Thailand. Every American ally in the region is taking notes. They're asking themselves a fundamental question. If this is how Washington treats South Korea, a country that has done everything America asked, what does that mean for us? Japan recently negotiated its own trade arrangements with the Trump administration. Are they next if their parliament doesn't move fast enough on ratification? Australia has been a stalwart partner in confronting Chinese military expansion. Does that count for anything when trade negotiations hit a snag? The Philippines just granted the U.S. access to additional military bases. Will they face tariff threats if their Congress balks at some future agreement? This is how alliances erode. Not through dramatic ruptures, but through 1,000 small humiliations that make partners question whether the relationship is worth the cost. And we need to talk about what this means for how American power is being exercised, because the constitutional and procedural dimensions here are genuinely alarming. The President of the United States has broad authority over trade policy. The Constitution grants Congress the power to regulate commerce, but decades of legislation, from the Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act of 1934 to the Trade Act of 1974, have delegated significant discretion to the executive branch. So Trump's ability to impose tariffs isn't in question. What's concerning is how he's wielding that power. Traditionally, major tariff decisions go through an interagency process. The Office of the United States Trade Representative analyzes the impact. The Commerce Department weighs in on domestic industry effects. The State Department evaluates diplomatic consequences. The National Security Council assesses strategic implications. Career experts provide data and analysis. Legal counsel ensures compliance with international trade law and World Trade Organization obligations. This process exists for a reason. It prevents impulsive decisions driven by personal pique rather than national interest. It ensures that when America exercises economic power, we've thought through the second and third order consequences. But increasingly, we're seeing policy made by presidential decree via social media. No interagency review, no expert consultation, no diplomatic coordination. Just an announcement that sends bureaucrats scrambling to figure out how to implement something that was decided in isolation. This isn't just sloppy governance, it's dangerous. Because when you make foreign policy without consulting the people who understand the complexities, you get unintended consequences. You get allies who feel blindsided. You get adversaries who exploit the chaos. You get markets that panic because they can't predict what comes next. And speaking of what comes next, let's game out the likely scenarios because this crisis isn't over, it's just beginning. Scenario 1. South Korea capitulates quickly. The National Assembly, faced with economic catastrophe and political pressure from the presidential office, rushes the ratification bill through. They hold emergency sessions, cut short the normal deliberative process, and give Trump what he wants within days or weeks. The tariffs never actually take effect, and Trump declares victory. But even in this best-case scenario, the damage is done. South Korean legislators will remember being forced to abandon their constitutional responsibilities under external pressure. Korean voters will remember their democratic processes being overridden to appease an American president's impatience. And the next time Washington asks Seoul for cooperation on security issues, there will be a lingering resentment, a sense that this is a one-sided relationship where South Korea bears all the costs and risks. Scenario 2. The National Assembly digs in. Perhaps opposition parties, seeing political opportunity, decide to make this a test of South Korean sovereignty. They refuse to be bullied. The tariffs take effect. South Korean exports to America plummet. The already fragile economy tips into recession. Unemployment rises. And suddenly, anti-American sentiment, which has historically been a minority position in South Korean politics, starts gaining mainstream traction. In this scenario, Beijing offers South Korea an economic lifeline, preferential trade terms, increased investment, access to Chinese markets to offset American losses. South Korea finds itself pulled deeper into China's economic orbit, weakening the alliance structure that has kept the Indo-Pacific stable for 7 decades. Scenario 3, and perhaps the most likely, messy compromise. South Korea's National Assembly ratifies the deal, but with modifications or conditions that save face domestically. Trump declares partial victory, but threatens additional measures if implementation doesn't meet his standards. The relationship limps forward, wounded but not broken, with neither side satisfied and trust between the allies permanently degraded. Any of these scenarios represents a strategic setback for American interests in Asia. And that's before we consider how this plays with other ongoing trade disputes and alliance management challenges around the world. Europe is already navigating its own tariff battles with Washington. NATO allies are being pressured to increase defense spending while simultaneously facing American trade restrictions. Canada is dealing with threats to its auto industry. Mexico has been repeatedly targeted over immigration and trade. Everywhere you look, American allies are being forced to choose between maintaining good relations with Washington and protecting their own economic and political interests. This creates opportunities for adversaries. Russia benefits when NATO is divided and distracted. China benefits when Asian allies question American reliability. Iran benefits when Middle Eastern partners wonder if American security guarantees are worth the diplomatic cost. We need to understand what's happening here in historical context, because this isn't the first time America has used economic pressure to influence allies. During the Cold War, the United States frequently leveraged its economic power to keep allies in line, to prevent them from trading with the Soviet bloc, to ensure they supported American foreign policy positions. But there was a crucial difference. Cold War economic pressure was nested within a clear strategic framework. America was leading a coalition against an existential threat. The sacrifices we asked of allies were justified by the shared project of containing Soviet expansion. And crucially, American leaders worked through diplomatic channels, building coalitions, making the case for why these measures served collective interests. What we're witnessing now lacks that strategic coherence. The tariffs on South Korea aren't part of a broader plan to counter Chinese influence. If anything, they undermine that goal by pushing Seoul toward Beijing. They're not serving a clear national security objective. They're a punishment for insufficient speed in legislative processes. This is economic statecraft reduced to personal pique. It's diplomacy by tweet. It's alliance management as protection racket. And the most frustrating part is that it's completely unnecessary. South Korea was going to ratify this deal. No serious observer doubted that. President Lee's government negotiated the agreement in good faith. They want American investment. They need American security guarantees. The legislative delay was procedural, not substantive. By forcing a crisis where none needed to exist, Trump has achieved nothing except damaging a relationship that took decades to build. He's made American leadership look capricious and unreliable. He's given ammunition to everyone in South Korea who argues that their country should pursue a more independent foreign policy, less tied to Washington's whims. The trade minister is flying to Washington right now for emergency talks with Commerce Secretary Lutnick. They'll probably work something out. Some face-saving formula where South Korea accelerates the ratification process and Trump agrees to hold off on the tariff increase. Both sides will claim victory. The immediate crisis will pass. But the long-term damage to American credibility can't be walked back with a negotiated settlement. Every ally is now on notice that even full compliance with American demands might not be enough. That democratic processes are subordinate to presidential timelines, that the post-World War II system of alliances built on shared values and mutual respect has been replaced by something more transactional and coercive. 10 years from now, when historians write about the erosion of American power in the Indo-Pacific, they won't point to a single catastrophic moment. They'll trace a series of smaller decisions. Tariff threats here, alliance strains there, trust eroded incrementally, that collectively pushed allies to hedge their bets, diversify their security partnerships, and question whether American leadership was worth the cost. This week's tariff threat against South Korea will be one of those data points. A moment when Washington chose short-term political theater over long-term strategic relationships. When we treated a trusted ally like a delinquent debtor. When we demonstrated that in the current system, even doing everything America asks provides no protection from public humiliation and economic punishment. The Korean National Assembly will probably vote. The legislation will likely pass. The immediate crisis will fade from headlines. But every Asian ally is recalculating right now, weighing the benefits of American partnership against the costs of American unreliability, considering alternatives, contingencies, hedges. And that recalculation, multiplied across dozens of relationships and thousands of decisions over the coming years, is how empires decline, not with a bang, but with a series of unforced errors that convince allies they need to prepare for a post-American world. The tariffs on South Korea are one more brick removed from the foundation of American credibility. The structure still stands, for now, but every brick matters, and we're running out of margin for error.